What's up, people? I was gonna go through the other two themes that we didn't have time to go through in class, just so you get the big picture. Again, this is kind of more like if you don't know anything else about this time period, these would be the big things to know. Sorry, I'm standing here looking at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo from the Mexican-American War. Once again, you can see the territory that the U.S. gained, pretty much half of Mexico at the time. So you got this big chunk, well, claim of Texas, and then California, and then the southwest of the United States, or the northwest of what was Mexico, or what was the northwest of Mexico. Anyway, that's not important. What's important is starting with theme number 2, which are political developments. So my big essential question here is, how did politics change in the following ways during the 1800s, or the early 1800s, that's leading up to the Civil War? And there's two big areas that we're going to talk about, which are Supreme Court power and building a more quote unquote participatory democracy. So having more people participating in government in the early 1800s. So the first big thing is the rise of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court being a stronger branch of government than maybe was originally intended. So one of the people that is significant related to that is John Marshall. So he was like the original, or one of the, not the original, but the one that we really remember anyway, Supreme Court Justice, or Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So he was appointed by John Adams right at the end of John Adams' term. So John Adams appointed a bunch of what they call midnight judges. So right at the end of his term, he appointed a whole bunch of judges and got them passed through. So if you think about like the Supreme Court issues now with getting a Supreme Court judge right before the election, this was even worse. This was like the night before he just, or not the night before, but really close to the end. So John Marshall is a Federalist, which means he's a supporter of a larger federal government. He's going to want a bigger role for the federal government in just politics in general. So he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for over 30 years, so almost this entire time period. And then he essentially builds the judiciary into a co-equal branch. So judicial originally, there's not much that's said about it in the Constitution. It says that there's a Supreme Court, and then it says that like the legislature will set up other courts. And they'll interpret the law. And that's pretty much it. So he's really is credited with building up the power of the Supreme Court. And the really big case is Marbury v. Madison. And it's not so much important that you know what happened in Marbury v. Madison. It's not super exciting. It's just more about what the outcome was and why it's significant. So basically, I'll run through the story really quickly. President Adams named a judge. His name was William Marbury, and he named him a federal judge, but he didn't actually like deliver the papers that said, hey, you're an official judge. It's kind of a formality, like he was a judge anyway, but he didn't get the papers. It was called the commission. So Thomas Jefferson, when he became president after John Adams, he was an anti-federalist. He was the first Democratic Republican president. He was not a federalist. He told his Secretary of State, James Madison, not to deliver the papers. He was like, we're going to just hold off. We're going to try to stall this guy as long as we can. And William Marbury brought him to court and said, you have to force the Secretary of State, James Madison, to give me my papers and make me an official judge. And he brought that it went all the way before the Supreme Court. And what happened was the Supreme Court did something that was unknown at the time and not really thought to be a thing that was possible. And they declared the act that Marbury was suing under, it's called the Judiciary Act of 1789, unconstitutional. So basically, it didn't really matter, but they told Marbury, like, we can't rule on this because this act that gives us this power is actually unconstitutional. And this was the first time, really, that the Supreme Court ruled that something could go against the Constitution, and that the Supreme Court has the ability or the power to say that it can rule things to be unconstitutional. And that it develops this concept called judicial review, which is one of the biggest powers that the Supreme Court currently has, which is that the Supreme Court can declare that certain laws or certain actions by the government are unconstitutional. They go against the Constitution and can be thrown out. So this was not a power that was actually given to the Supreme Court by the Constitution. It's something that like John Marshall and his Supreme Court kind of decide is implied in the Constitution that they have the power to do this. So John Marshall, really significant justice in expanding the power of the federal government via the Supreme Court, and also this concept of judicial review, which comes from the case Marbury v. Madison. The other thing that you have created is this thing called the second party system. So the Federalists die out after the War of 1812, which isn't as important about how that happened. But in the 1830s, you have the rise of what's called the second party system. So you have this new party, and you start to see the really divided two-party system that America still has today. We have different parties today, but this is the beginning of having kind of a two-party system. So you have two parties. The Democrats and the Whigs. And the Whigs are no longer around anymore, but the Democrats are, but they're a little bit different than they were back then. So just a quick comparison for them. You can stop this. You don't need to memorize every single thing about them, but you should kind of get an understanding of what their beliefs are. So the big leader of the Democrats was Andrew Jackson. He becomes president in 1828. Sorry. And he's like, kind of reforms the party in his image and really wants to make it about the common man and increasing political participation for rural farmers and like workers and things like that. The Whigs, their big leader, his name was Henry Clay. He created this thing that we talked about in class called the American system. He was really big on legislative power and wanted a strong federal government. So the big comparison between the two is how strong they wanted the federal government to be. You can kind of think of the Democrats as being like the old anti-federalists that wanted a weak federal government. They didn't want a lot of government action. They opposed tariffs or taxes on foreign goods. They wanted the government to spend as little amount as possible. And if you're kind of politically astute and you're thinking this sounds a lot like the Republicans today, this is a similar type of like conservatism that they had back then. The Whigs, on the other hand, they wanted a strong federal government, especially the legislative branch. They were kind of formed in response to Andrew Jackson. Like, they don't like him. They think he's taking too much power for the president from things like the Indian Removal Act, and there's a fight over the Bank of the United States and things like that. So they believe that the government should spend money on infrastructure to support business and manufacturing, and they also supported taxes on foreign goods to help businesses. So here are the people that usually supported them: small farmers, Southerners to an extent, people that were laborers in cities. A lot of Catholic immigrants, like Irish and German immigrants, supported Democrats. There were some Northern Democrats as well, people that weren't really centered in the Northeast. And then the Whigs were mostly the people that would benefit from these programs. So if you look at these programs up here, the people that would benefit would be like the bankers, the shippers, people in New England that are, a lot of those patriots from the Revolution. Protestants tended to like Whigs a little bit better, and then the professional and business classes in the cities. So you start to have this break, but overall the Democrats had most of the people. They were the more popular party by quite a bit. The Whigs only had like 2 presidents ever, and one of them was like by accident. So that, you had a couple issues there. They were both split on slavery. They both had disagreements about slavery. The Democrats were very enthusiastic about Manifest Destiny, whereas the Whigs were kind of a little more opposed and didn't really like westward expansion as much, or at least getting involved in foreign affairs. So you have the beginning of this second party system where you start to have these two parties that are pretty entrenched until 1854, when the Whigs and a bunch of other parties get together and form what becomes today's Republican Party. Even though you might be looking at the Democrats and being like, they sound a lot like Republicans, that's kind of because they were much more conservative. That starts to shift actually in the 1900s. So don't worry about that right now. But that's another issue of increasing democracy, increasing participation. Sorry about that. Something happened here. So winning the vote, reducing property restrictions became a big thing, getting rid of the requirement that you had to own property in order to vote. And then you had what's called the era of universal white male suffrage, which means that the U.S. reached like the epitome of democracy at that time by allowing all white men to vote regardless of property restrictions or any other type of discrimination. Black voters were mostly restricted, but actually 5 states allowed blacks to vote by 1855, and virtually no women were allowed to vote. You did have some western states eventually that allow, like Utah, allowing women to vote much later. But some of those Western states were the first states to allow women to vote. But this is a big thing, even though it's still just one class of citizen. Allowing way more people to participate in the democracy is a huge development for U.S. politics. All right, so take some time to stop me talking and fill in the left side of the politics. Hopefully they gave you some examples of some issues in politics that were developing over time, and maybe give you some ideas about who you might want to think about drafting for your fantasy history league based on those specific people and events I was talking about. So theme 4 is social issues. So my two big questions are, what groups were seeing some problems in society during the 1800s, and then what changes did these groups seek? And there will be a lot more of these to look at as we get into the Fantasy History League as well. So the first big event is called the Second Great Awakening, and you might be wondering what the First Great Awakening was, and it happened way back before the Revolutionary era, but this is the second one. So it happened from about 1790 to 1840, so it actually started a bit before this time period we're in, but it was a Protestant revival movement. So we're talking this rooted in Christianity and Protestantism, and it was a big revival of religious belief. So religion had kind of died down a little bit in the United States in the 1800s, and it starts to see this big revival. So there's a couple different ways this kind of manifests itself. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but you had camp revivals, you had frontier religions, and like what was called the burned over district in Western New York. They started to talk about man's spiritual equality before God, which was a big deal because it starts to talk about all men having spiritual equality, including not just white men. They started to focus a little bit more on like simple religion and having direct relationships with God, and kind of not necessarily having to listen to a specific church. One of the big figures was Charles G. Finney, who was a Presbyterian minister, and he was a big leader at the time. So there's a couple different causes of this. There was a lot of reaction to new types of philosophies that were being developed during the time, especially like a focus on more empirical science and rationalism. And the big effect of it, the reason we're really focusing on the Second Great Awakening as a movement, is because it stimulates this belief that society needs to be reformed. So it really kicks off a whole bunch of reform movements that aren't necessarily tied to religion, but are influenced by this Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening's idea was that like Jesus Christ was going to return and society needed to be purified and helped. So there's a whole bunch of social movements that come out of the Great Awakening, but we're also going to look at some that happened around this time as well. Oh, there's Charles Finney. Sorry. So one big thing is women becoming more involved in social issues and politics. So even though they couldn't vote yet, still getting involved. So the abolitionist movement, if you're not familiar with abolition, it usually means the movement to abolish or get rid of slavery. So women saw a lot of legal similarities between themselves and enslaved African Americans. So they started to become more involved in the push to get rid of slavery throughout the United States. A couple different names here for you. Sojourner Truth is right here. She's an African American woman who was active in the abolition movement and the women's movement. There's a lot of women, though, that even within the abolitionist movement, they were discriminated against. There's a couple different women. Angela Sarah Grimke gave a lot of speeches to mixed audiences. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott they attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, but there were a few seats on the floor because they were women, and they decided to hold their own convention for anti-slavery movements. So women getting more involved. Women getting more involved in social movements is a big development or change in this time. Well, not necessarily change, but it becomes kind of on a more massive scale. One major event for the women's movement in general, just for the women's movement, was the Seneca Falls Convention. It happened in 1849, so a little bit outside this time period, but it was in Seneca Falls, New York. You had a bunch of suffragists or women that were looking for more women's rights and rights to vote. So you had Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you had Lucretia Mott over here, you had Frederick Douglass, who was actually very active in the African American abolitionist movement. There's a big debate whether to demand the right to vote, and they did. They demanded that women have the right to vote. It's considered by Mott to be the start of the modern, or not the modern, but the 1800s women's rights movement, which continues on into the 1900s. And they issued this document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which is very, very similar to the Declaration of Independence, but talks a lot about women's rights in society and women being equal to men. And then finally, you have this idea of the cult of domesticity. So even though you had this women's rights movement that was happening, there were groups of women and men, but this is more of like actually women talking about this more conservative approach to women's rights, where they said that women should be true women, and true women have upper and middle class values where they are domestic and submissive to men and more pure and peaceful, and that they should have a what was called a quote unquote separate sphere in the home, and men would have more of the public role. And they opposed the right to vote, but they still left the door open to education a little bit. So the cult of domesticity is this concept that occurs as a kind of a reaction to the women's movement in the 1800s. That's more like a traditional role for women. And it comes from Victorian England, actually, is the idea of like the role of women in society. And the last thing is you have this kind of new national culture that's developing at this time. So within the arts, whether that be like painting or literature, you have these new ideas that are combining. It's kind of this weird thing in art and history, right, in this time period, where you have like this old world romanticism, where you're showing a lot of emotion and the self instead of society, and like untamed nature, with these new world themes of kind of exploration, discovery, American landscapes, human beings and nature like working together. So you have this blending of these old and new cultural ideas within the arts during this time period. So in literature, you had this movement called transcendentalism, where the authors believed that there was this goodness in people and a good nature of individualism, and people should try to like transcend everyday life and really seek like a higher purpose. So two really popular people were Ralph Waldo Emerson right here and Henry David Thoreau, that were very popular in the transcendentalist movement. You also had people that went against the American optimism at the time, like Edgar Allan Poe. And you also can see this like new romanticism in architecture as well. Oh, sorry, there's Edgar Allan Poe. There's a little chronology for you of some things that were happening during this time period, but hopefully that kind of ties up some of the themes. You can start to see like how society really this time period is a lot about change. There are some continuities like slavery. The U.S. wanting to expand is kind of a continuity, but there's a lot of change that occurs during this very, very small chunk of time of just under half a century. So get those left-hand sides filled in. If you have any questions, I will definitely help when you get back, but hopefully that gets you the context you need for the Fantasy History League.